This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV Profit.
I'm delighted to welcome you all to this RICS conference on planning and delivering urban infrastructure in cities. RICS is a not-for-profit royal charter body headquartered in London and the world's leading self-regulatory professional body for qualifications and standards in land, property and construction. The genesis of this conference is the RICS Vision for Cities a global initiative that was launched at MIPIM in 2009 with a view to draw a vision for cities and a roadmap for the development of cities with the rapid urbanization that we're witnessing across different parts of the world. A slow but unstoppable change is taking place in India too, and this will affect everything people do, the way people live and work. While there is more awareness about urbanization, there is a need to fast track and take visible action. The problems are staggering in India, and it is imperative that we pay attention immediately to the possibilities and consequences. Who will pay for the mammoth new requirements of infrastructure, housing, utilities and cleanup? Then there is the challenge of how will these cities be developed? How will they be financed? How can we attract large private investments to build the infrastructure? What is the future of private finance initiative and public-private partnerships to build the cities of the future? What kind of incentives are required? There is also a problem that there is a dearth of institutional capacity, and for all this infrastructure that needs to be built, despite our large population, India does not have trained urban professionals, an area that RICS is committed to addressing. This conference will dwell on each of these questions, as well as many others, and try and find answers. Thank you so much.
Planning and delivering urban infrastructure in Indian cities. We have an extremely high-powered panel today. So let me set the ball rolling by asking Sri Naveen Kumar, who is really at the top of the urban development department in India, what he thinks has been the achievements of the JNNURM till date, and what reforms he sees in JNNURM going forward.
Srivats, as you know, the JNNURM was introduced in 2005, perhaps the first comprehensive program in the urban sector. It is now in the 7th year of implementation, and in this period it has achieved substantial gains, both by way of developing the urban infrastructure as well as implementation of reforms. Now the question is, how do we look at the future? Should JNNURM continue? Should it continue in the same form as it is today? We have learned a lot of lessons, and that says that number one, the focus on urban sector needs to continue, and government realizes this, and there is going to be a better focus during the 12th plan on the urban sector. The second point is that the investments that have been made, they have been substantial, but as the high-powered expert committee headed by Ishar Ahluwalia has said, that the investment requirement is much larger, and they have suggested that the investment, which is at the level of 0.1% of GDP today, should increase to about 0.25% of GDP. That is 2.5 times increase in the investment is required. Thirdly, what has come out very clearly, that the same treatment cannot be meted to the bigger urban local bodies, the larger corporations, because the issues pertaining to them are quite different from the issues of the smaller municipalities and nagarpalikas. And therefore, the approach will have to be more custom oriented to the needs, the local needs of the local bodies.
Anshul, if I could move to you from the private sector perspective, how does the private sector look at urban development in India? It has done a lot of interesting contribution to infrastructure, but do you think the private sector can come into urban development in cities as well, and if so, in what form?
I think right now the private sector really, if you look at it, basic infrastructure, support infrastructure, there's only few cases people, the first impression is that it's too tedious. I don't think capital is such a major issue. It's just that the private sector wants to get in, but they want to stay away because they feel that it's too complicated to get into infrastructure investment, The private sector would get into the core infrastructure, and we've seen companies talking about water, sewage side, road side, but it's still not there. I think the key is capital, no doubt, will be raised. is how to make it interesting for them or attractive for them to invest, where they can, no doubt, infrastructure investment would be more long term. And everybody knows if you put in infrastructure, it's not a 2 or 3 year period. You have to, it will require long term capital. But the ease of doing business, ease of getting in, and with clear norms and exit eventually, is what is deterring private sector not coming to the sector. And exit is another, I don't want to go on in too much detail, but exit is also a big concern for private capital to come in. Because if they go anywhere else, they know finally, even if it's 10 years, 15 years, they know they can exit. In India, for any investment, leaving infrastructure, even in real estate, exit is a big deterrent also.
Mr. Verma, if I may move to you. If I look at East Asia, my research tells me that countries, even small countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, one of the major planks on which the political parties came to power there was on affordable mass housing. And if you look at Hong Kong, say 20 years back, or Singapore, one of the primary drivers of reform there was unlocking the land markets and bringing about mass housing, affordable housing. What is constraining India from doing something similar, at least around our major cities?
There is need for affordable housing, affordable mass housing, and that's where we need institutional structure which has the capacity to deliver mass housing on affordable basis and which is sustainable. Our problem is one of scales. So when we are comparing it with other countries, I think we really have to look at it from the perspective of big scales, big requirement on our limited resources. The public-private partnership has worked in certain cases, but we have isolated examples of success, and that's something which we are looking at from the project side, the supply side, the PPP on a large scale, where the public agency and the government commitment comes in with public policy intent, combined with the efficiency of the private sector, along with the financing from the financial institutions. That's the kind of institutional structure which we need to develop and scale up.
Sanjay, if I may move to you. If I were to ask you specifically, do you think creating urban cities and creating urban infrastructure in cities is something which should primarily be the function of the sovereign, or should it be something that the private sector should take the lead in?
As far as infrastructure is concerned, I can tell you that it has to be a joint exercise. Typically, I'm seeing all cities, all governments are facing huge amount of shortage of money. And basically, they're looking at the private sector to substitute the public sector in creating infrastructure. I'm a little tempted to answer the earlier question that you raised, and that's an interesting one, about what is really constraining the lands. One is that lands typically were considered to be the stronghold of the government domain. Basically, government wanted to strongly control the lands, and I'll give you 3 examples of laws. One was the Urban Land Ceiling Act, which came in the 70s. It pretty much sucked out almost about 20 to 25% of the land from the urban areas. That is one which led to increase in costs. Second was the Rent Control Act. Rent Control Act, pretty much any private investment in housing became very difficult for commercial purposes. And third, again in 70s, when Mumbai's population, and I'll tell you my experience about Mumbai, when Mumbai's population touched 7 million, the government of Maharashtra, the Ministry of Urban Development, actually announced that we need to control the population of the city of Mumbai, and to do that, the FSI of Mumbai, which was almost 4 at that time, was brought down to 1. The innocent belief was that in case you construct less, you actually might be having less people living there. What happened was people still came into Mumbai, and they started living in the slums. The slumification of Mumbai happened because of this. In fact, ironically, the slums became a market solution to the problem of constraint of land in the city, which was a government created problem.
Let me pick up on something that he said and move to Mr. Siddiqui. The muni bonds market in America, municipal bonds are one of the most thriving markets in the US, and IFC has been a predominant contributor to affordable housing financing in different parts of the world. You worked there in the past, and now you are in the private sector in India. What role do you really see? Do you see private investment as a bottleneck for urban infrastructure? And if yes, what is the way forward?
Let me preface first by saying that I think if we put things in perspective, over the last 10 years, what India has achieved in terms of investments in telecom, in the road sector, in the power sector, very few countries in the world have achieved in such a short span of time. Of course, there's a lot more that needs to be done. Now, in terms of muni-finance in the US, why has in the US, infrastructure financing is mostly done by municipalities? Why has this been possible? It's primarily because good corporate governance exists at the municipal level. There is greater accountability, there's transparency in terms of decision making, in terms of rule of law. And I think for India, for us, to meet the tremendous needs in terms of investments, we're talking about $1 trillion over the next 5 years, and I think that there will be a multiple of that over the next, beyond the next 5 years. Rule of law, corporate governance is something we need to tackle right up front. It's something that is within our control. I think one must be rational about what is really required to give confidence to investors, to lenders, to come in and invest. And private sector, I think it's without question, has to play a very, very key role. It has been shown throughout the world that private sector involvement in infra leads to better quality of service, greater accountability, more people are served, and it's because people are held accountable. So I think there is an important role for the government to play. A lot of infrastructure services involve public good. So there is a very important role for the government to play in terms of ensuring that services are in fact affordable, that quality services being provided, that there is no abuse of monopoly or oligopolistic rights. And also, of course, private sector cannot take care of everyone, and it is important that infrastructure projects are developed in a manner, services are provided in a manner that no social group is left behind.
One of the key factors for succeeding in a market like India is the ability to thrive in ambiguity. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Tiwari of IDFC. IDFC has put to work over 800 million, and they've done it very successfully. You invested in roads, you invested in an airport, you invested in ports. So despite Sanjay's and Mr. Siddiqui's skepticism, I'd like to ask you, you're facing the same market as these guys are. What is it that you are doing right, which they're not able to understand or do as well as you are doing?
I think if we are looking safer from the perspective of a lender, one has to understand when would a lender lend. And one of the key elements there is when he sees that the revenue risk are taken care of. Because the revenue risk perceived by the private lender or even the private developer, for example, are too high. Even the commercial lending that happens in the urban infrastructure sector, when municipalities borrow from banks, they borrow on their general revenue account. That's the security that against which they borrow. Now, it's not a project finance which is happening there. Now, another important issue to understand here is that from the perspective of a developer, the baseline data is completely missing here. So from that perspective, we are looking at the security that is there against which some municipalities can borrow or a lending could happen, that is pretty weak there.
Mr. Bhagat, if I may turn to you, PPP seems to be working in several sectors in India. It seems to be working pretty well in roads. It's working in airports. Do you think PPP is something viable when we look at our cities?
Actually, when we look at the European experience and you look at transport the European experience here, there have been various delegations that come here, looked at the ground level reality and have figured out, yes, PPP perhaps is the only way forward if they were to bring in their technologies, if they were to bring in their capital. Because a foreign investor is going to find, a foreign strategic investor is going to find extremely difficult in operating in this environment on a standalone basis. There are foreign few infrastructure companies operating here which are wholly foreign owned. So definitely a PPP, because they need an Indian vendor, they need the government as an important stakeholder in the whole process. And one of the key issues has been highlighted right here is in terms of land acquisitions and various other aspects. So yes, PPP will definitely work. There is no doubt on that. The question is, can we iron out the issues that are surrounding which are inherent in the PPP? Can we iron out the issues which relate to from where the asset is going to arise? Can we iron out the issues of creating a long-term debt market? So once we have ironed out these kind of things, there is no long-term debt in the market, We've been talking about infrastructure for the last 15 years, but we have not done nothing about developing along the debt market.
Let me move to Mr. Das. The construction market in India, how rich and deep is it? Because urban India has a huge construction challenge, irrespective of whether it's done by the government or it's done by the private sector. Do you think that the construction market as it exists in India, do we have the wherewithal to do this? And is it modern enough compared to its peers in the West to meet this challenge?
See, the construction industry in India, I wouldn't say it's fully developed yet. And the new technologies are required, which has not been brought in to India. And if you try to bring it also, it's quite expensive. Unless you go for a mass housing systems and all that, the cost of the project cannot be brought down, floor area cost cannot be brought down. So the thing is that the technology has to change, the new construction methods have to be brought in so that we can go for a faster construction, and also it's not very regulated. See, anybody can charge anything depending on the place and the location.
The biggest challenge is skilled labor.
Yeah.
So Government of India has started this Sector Skill Development Council, and I think there's a huge gap as far as skill development is concerned. So you can bring in technology overnight literally if you have the capital, but to develop skilled labor will take a long time, and I don't think India has, surprisingly we keep on talking about a huge number of skilled labor India has, but the ground reality is an acute shortage of skilled labor, and I think that is a big constraint for the construction industry.
TNUDF was one of the success stories in urban development where the Tamil Nadu government, along with funding from the World Bank, reached out to private investors and did a lot very, very successfully. Why do you think the TNUDF model has not been replicated in other parts of the country? And what are the key governance reforms which you believe are required, especially in the smaller urban local bodies, to become more competitive with funds?
You can raise money from the market, whatever instrument you choose, only if the financial health of the local body is good. Unfortunately today, save and except the few larger municipal corporations, that is not the case. Therefore, that is another inhibiting factor.
So Deshmukh, would the GVK group go into, say, the Asansol municipality and invest in urban infrastructure there?
Yes, why not? If the project has clearly defined revenue streams. Secondly, if there is absolute clarity on the roles and responsibility of all the stakeholders involved in the project, and particularly the liabilities of the developer, if they're clearly stated, then certainly.
We turn to Dr. Tiwari. Do you agree we should ask whether the private sector would first fund it, and only if they say no, do we pass it on to the government as the next source of funding?
I think if I'm looking at from the urban infrastructure perspective, we have to understand some of the key features of this particular infrastructure sector. One of the things which is there is that the revenue by itself would not be sufficient to recover or to cover the capital cost in any way. Take for example the water supply project or any other project. By any means revenue is completely insufficient to do that. Now given that situation, now turning around the project and asking the private sector first whether you would be able to do it, probably they would be able to do it, and some of the examples which Sanjay has mentioned where real estate drives the project, in the sense like you can have convention.
Projects where real estate does not drive projects, where the revenue cannot, like in the case of metro. There is no metro in the world of the 114 metro systems wherein the revenue from metro ticket sales or advertisements alone cover for the capital cost. This is well known. Sure. So are you saying that the private sector will go into projects where the revenue from the cash flows does not cover the huge upfront capital investment? No, without a real estate component cross-subsidizing it?
I would call it the curse of the DMRC, because what has happened, DMRC's success in Delhi has prompted everybody to take up only metros. Everybody wants to see a metro in their city, howsoever unviable it is. Now, unless you have riding capacity of about 50,000-60,000 passengers per hour per direction, these projects are not going to be viable. But because it's very fashionable now, and the only agency which can do the DPRs is DMRC, so all the projects are being done and they are taken to the bidding stage, and nobody can bid for those projects. But there are alternative modes of transport which can deliver as efficiently the requirements for the city. We are not in a position to do that because there is no DMRC there to prepare those projects. So I think it's possible. To answer your question, it is possible for us to take up those projects for specifically those cities which don't require real estate cost subsidy.
And very, very curiously, all to the right side of me are talking about private capital coming in. As someone from the private sector in a research think tank, let me ask you this. In 2007-8, where Reliance Energy raised its famous equity in the market, they raised about 3 billion. If you look at the equity from all infrastructure equity raised in that year, it totaled up to roughly about $6 billion. You add in the equities which are put in by private developers in their own pocket, it's probably another $5 to $6 billion. So in all put together, in 2008, which was the best year for our stock market in a very long time, the total money raised from the market from infrastructure equities was roughly about 10 to 12 billion. The need we are talking about over a 5-year horizon is 1.5 trillion of debt and equity. If you're looking at public, if you're looking at equities of what, say 1/3 of those, we are looking at close to 400 billion, if not more. And in our best year, we raised what I just told you. So do you really think the money is there in the private sector to do this?
There is money. Why we say money is there? Because earlier there was nothing. So now it's better than nothing. So that's why we say money is there. But it's not to the scale of $400 billion certainly. And the fact is we can get international capital. There is money in private hands also. But till the time that money knows that it is easy, it's less painful than extracting a tooth, to invest in what do you call it, in infrastructure, that money will not come. And that's why, and transparency, there are many issues, everybody knows. Transparency is an issue, rule of law is an issue, exit, which nobody talks about, I had mentioned right in the beginning. End of the day, that money has to exit. There is no route for exiting that money. So yes, we can say
most people exit through an IPO.
But again, that depends on the market and so many things. So it's not as easy as it could be in any other place.
On this issue of the first right of refusal to the private sector for projects, I would like to make this point that it's a very interesting thought and we should work towards it. But we must realize that this requires a lot of preparation. The reason is that the private sector, number one, doesn't have experience of working in urban sector. They do not know how the local bodies and the government work. They do not have an idea of the mechanisms and modalities which work there. So a lot of preparation the private sector will also have to do in order to come to a situation where they can exploit this first right of refusal if it is given to them.
Sorry, part of the reason they don't know is because it's complicated.
Yeah, I know.
So it is no doubt the private sector has to be...
If I were to wear my hat as a civil servant, I'd be the first to say you can't have a risk-free asset waiting for you to come and invest. India is a risky country. It's a damn complex country. Whoever told you there's a risk-free bond waiting for you to invest, it's not. There's a risk and you need to take it. Price the risk appropriately. Right?
And return appropriately.
And return appropriately. In the right way.
Just to add to the point in terms of the total resource required and is it doable or not. Even if you take 25% public contribution of the $1.3 trillion or whatever it is, okay, if the math just doesn't work out over the next 5 years, it has never been such an active in equity, the whole dimensions of your entire year's floating public float in the market, you're asking me to be raised much more than that, many times more than that, over in every year and year on year for the next 5 years. So yes, there are serious concerns about whether the quantum that has come out, whether it will be funded, whether we will be able to fund it or not.
I think we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank my panel for an extremely invigorating debate. And as we end by saying, Mera Bharat Mahan, I'm sure the next 20 years we'll see a lot of things happening in the infrastructure space, both from the private and the public perspective. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.